The desolate village and the first signs nestled in the heart of an unnamed desolate region. The village of Varnell clung to the edge of the world like a forgotten relic of a bygone age. Its crooked, weather-worn buildings leaned precariously against the wind, their windows dark and uninviting. The roads, if they could be called that, were little more than winding paths of packed earth, leading to homes that seemed more like tombs than places of habitation. Few outsiders ever came to Varnell, and those who did rarely returned. The villagers spoke in hushed tones of the strange things that happened in the woods beyond the village, of the whispers that drifted through the trees at night, and of the eyes that watched from the darkness. It was in this place, surrounded by an atmosphere thick. The arrival at the edge of the world. The village of Varnell lay nestled in the shadow of the Black Spire, a jagged monolith that pierced the sky like a wound in the earth. Few dared to venture near, for the wind that howled through the valley carried whispers of things best left undisturbed. Dr. Elias Mercer had come not for the tales, but for the truth. He had spent years poring over obscure manuscripts and forgotten journals, each one hinting at an ancient presence that had long since faded from human memory. Now, standing at the edge of the village, he felt the weight of that history pressing upon him. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and something older, something that did not belong to the natural world. The village itself was. With unease that the protagonists first arrived. A scholar by trade, they had come in search of knowledge, of the forgotten histories of the region, of the strange symbols that had been found carved into the cliffs that overlooked the village. They had heard of the village from a colleague, a man who had vanished without a trace after his last visit. The stories that followed were vague, but they were enough to pique the protagonist's curiosity. There was something about Varnell that called to them, an unshakable pull that they could not explain. At first, the village seemed no different from any other. The people were wary, their eyes avoiding the protagonist, as if they were something to be feared rather than studied. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and something else, something old, of the forgotten history did not pique the protagonist's curiosity. There was something about Varnell that called to them, an unshakable pull that they could not explain. A relic of a bygone era, its buildings hewn from black stone that seemed to drink in the light. The people who lived here moved with an eerie quiet, their eyes avoiding Mercer's as if they feared what he might see. He had expected hostility, but what he found was something more unsettling, a reverence, as though they knew something he did not. Mercer had come seeking answers, drawn by the accounts of disappearances that had plagued the village for generations. The villagers spoke in hushed tones of a presence that had once walked among them, a being that had left its mark upon the land and the minds of those who had come before. Some claimed it had been a god, others a demon. But Mercer knew that the truth was far more terrifying. He had read of the protagonists had expected to find a place of isolation, but they had not anticipated the strange sense of being watched, as though unseen eyes were following their every step. It was not long before the first signs of something unnatural began to appear. The protagonist noticed strange symbols etched into the stones near the village's edge, their shapes unlike anything they had ever seen. They were not the work of any known civilization, and their meaning eluded even the most seasoned scholars. The villagers, when asked about them, refused to speak, their expressions dark with something that bordered on fear. As the days passed, the protagonist became more attuned to the village's peculiar nature. The nights were filled with whispers that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. The stars above seemed to shift in. Entity in the margins of forgotten texts, in the ink-stained pages of journals written by men who had seen things they could not explain. As he stepped through the village, the silence deepened. The only sound was the wind, carrying with it the faintest whisper, like a voice just beyond hearing. Mercer paused, his breath catching in his throat. He was not alone. He could feel it, a presence pressing against the edges of his mind, watching, waiting. He had come to uncover the past, but now he wondered if he had been summoned for a purpose far greater than he had imagined. The forgotten entity. Long before the village of Varnell had ever been built, before the first human foot had ever touched the black stone that now formed its foundations, there was an entity that had existed. Ways that defied natural explanation, and in the depths of the forest beyond the village, something stirred, something ancient, something waiting, the unearthed relic. The first true sign of the entity's presence came not in the village, but in the forest beyond it. Drawn by the strange symbols that had been found near the village's edge, the protagonist ventured deeper into the woods, following the markings that seemed to lead them in a direction no map could explain. The trees grew denser as they walked, their gnarled branches entwining overhead like the fingers of some unseen ancient being. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and something else, something old, something stirred, something ancient, something ancient, something ancient, something ancient, something ancient, something roots and overgrowth that had grown crichtonist. Found it. A. beyond time. It was not born, nor was it created. It had simply always been a presence that had drifted through the void between the stars, watching, waiting, and waiting still. The ancients, those who had come before the first written word, had called it by many names. Some had whispered of it in reverence, others in terror. But none had ever fully understood its nature. The entity was not of this world, nor any that had ever been conceived by human minds. It was a being of pure entropy, a force that existed outside the boundaries of time and space, a presence that had no form yet could be felt in the deepest recesses of the soul. Its essence was not flesh, nor was it light, but something in between, a shifting mass of shadows and void. A thing, the entity, was not of this world, nor any that had ever been conceived by human minds. Or any that had ever been conceived by human minds. It was a being of pure entropy, a force that existed outside the boundaries of time. Massive stone structure, half buried in the earth, rose from the ground like the remains of a forgotten monument. The carvings that adorned its surface were unlike anything the protagonist had ever seen. Vast, swirling patterns that seemed to shift and writhe when viewed from different angles. At the center of the structure, a single doorway stood, its edges worn by time but not by nature. It had been opened once, long ago, and perhaps not for the first time. Heart pounding, the protagonists stepped through the doorway, their breath shallow as they entered a chamber that had not seen the light of day for centuries. The air inside was colder than it should have been, thick with the scent of something ancient and unnameable. The walls were lined with murals, their pigments faded but still visible, depicting scenes of a defied all known laws of existence. It had no face, no eyes, no mouth, yet it was always watching. It had no voice, yet it spoke in the minds of those who had been touched by its presence, whispering secrets that could not be unlearned. Legends spoke of the entity's first appearance on this world, though no record of that time remained. Some claimed it had descended from the heavens in a storm of fire and darkness, while others said it had emerged from the depths of the earth, rising from the void beneath the land. The truth, if it could be called that, was buried in the forgotten past, lost to time and the relentless march of history. But its influence had never truly faded. It had shaped the world in ways that could not be explained, leaving world that did not belong to any known civilization. Towering figures, their forms indistinct, loomed over smaller, human-like beings, their expressions twisted in something that could only be described as terror. At the center of the chamber stood a pedestal upon which rested a single object, an artifact unlike anything the protagonist had ever encountered. It was a sphere, smooth and dark, its surface reflecting the flickering light of the protagonist's lantern in ways that defied logic. The moment they laid eyes on it, a strange sensation overtook them, as though something unseen was watching, waiting. Tentatively, the protagonists reached out, their fingers grazing the surface of the sphere. A jolt of something, electricity, fear, or perhaps both, shot through their body, and for a moment the world around them seemed to shift. The chamber pulsed with an unseen force, and, behind remnants of its presence in the form of strange symbols carved into the rock, in the strange dreams that haunted those who lived near the Black Spire, in the unexplainable disappearances that had plagued the village of Varnell for centuries, the entity was not evil, nor was it benevolent. It was simply indifferent, a force that existed beyond the comprehension of mortal beings. It did not seek to destroy or to create, but to observe, to watch, and to wait. It had no need for power, for dominion, or for any form of existence beyond its own. And yet, its presence had left an indelible mark upon the world. It had shaped the very fabric of reality, twisting the natural order in ways that could not be understood. It had influenced the rise and fall of civilizations, leaving the air grew thick with an almost tangible weight. The murals on the wall seemed to move, their figures twisting and writhing as if coming to life. The whispers that had haunted the village now filled the chamber, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of voices that spoke in a language that should not exist. Then, from the darkness beyond the pedestal, something stirred. The protagonist barely had time to react before the shadows coalesced into a form that was neither human nor beast. It was tall, impossibly tall, its body a shifting mass of darkness and light, its eyes, though they had no discernible shape, burning with an unnatural, otherworldly glow. The entity did not move with the grace of any known creature. It was as if the very air around it resisted its presence, bending and warping in. Behind only whispers and shadows in its wake. Its name, if it had one, had been lost to time. Some had called it the Watcher, others the Forgotten One. The ancients had spoken of it in hushed tones, fearing its presence and yet unable to look away. It had been the first thing to walk the earth, and it would be the last. It had no beginning, no end, and no purpose beyond its own existence. It was a thing that had always been, and it would always been, and it would always been. And now, as Dr. Elias Mercer stood at the edge of the village, feeling the weight of its presence pressing against his mind, he realized that the entity was not merely a forgotten relic of the past. It was still here, watching, waiting, and it had not forgotten him. Its wake. A deep, resonant hum filled the chamber, a sound that was not heard but felt, vibrating through the protagonist's bones. The entity did not speak, but its presence was overwhelming, a weight that pressed against the protagonist's mind, forcing them to the edge of comprehension. It was not a monster, not in a way that the world had ever defined such things. It was something older, something that had existed before the stars had burned and the universe had been shaped. The protagonists stumbled back, their breath coming in ragged gasps as they stared at the entity, their mind reeling with the realization that they had uncovered something that was never meant to be found. The descent into madness. The entity's presence was no longer confined to the chamber. It seeped into the protagonist's minds. The entity did not speak, but its protagonist spined. The entity did not speak. The descent into the unknown. Dr. Elias Mercer moved through the village with measured steps, his mind a tempest of questions and unease. The whispers in the wind had not ceased, and they seemed to follow him, lingering in the spaces between his thoughts. He had come to Varnell seeking answers, but the more he learned, the more he felt the weight of something far greater than himself pressing upon him. He had read of the entity in the margins of forgotten texts, in the ink-stained pages of journals written by men who had seen things they could not explain. But the accounts were fragmented, incomplete. There were no clear records of the entity's return, no definitive evidence that it had ever left, only the unspoken fear that it had never truly gone. Mercer's search led him to an insidious whisper that refused to be silenced. At first, it was subtle, a flicker of unease in the corner of their vision, a sense of being watched even when alone. But as the days passed, the whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they were no longer just sounds, but thoughts, invading the protagonist's mind like an infection. They spoke in a language that was not human, yet the protagonist understood them, though they could not explain how. The words were not meant for human ears, and yet they echoed in the protagonist's mind, filling them with a dread that gnawed at the edges of their sanity. The entity's influence began to manifest in the most horrifying ways. The protagonists found themselves unable to sleep, their dreams filled with vision of the entity's form, vast, shifting, and unknowable. They saw themselves stood them. The village elder, an old man whose eyes held the weight of centuries. The elder spoke little, but when he did, his words carried the gravity of something ancient. He spoke of the entity in hushed tones, of the time before the village had been built, when the land had been untouched by human hands. He spoke of the first settlers who had come to this place, only to vanish without a trace, their names lost to time. He did not know the entity's name, nor did he claim to understand its nature, but he knew one thing. It was not a thing to be confronted. It was a thing to be feared, but fear was not enough. Mercer had spent his life searching for the unknown, for the truths that had been buried beneath the weight of history. Standing before the entity, their body unraveling, their thoughts dissolving into the void, the dreams left them exhausted, their body aching with a pain that had no source, their mind fractured by the images that haunted them. When they tried to wake, the world around them felt wrong, as though the very air had thickened and the ground beneath their feet was not solid but something else, something that had no place in the natural order. Paranoia took root in the protagonist's mind, growing like a vine that twisted through their thoughts. They began to question everything, every sound, every shadow, every flicker of movement in the corner of their vision. The villagers, who had once been distant and wary, now seemed to watch them with an intensity that was almost unbearable. The protagonist could not tell if it was the... He would not turn away now. He pressed on, his determination growing with each step. He combed through the village archives, poring over brittle pages and faded ink, searching for any clue that might lead him to the entity's presence. He found old maps, sketches of the land that had been drawn by men who had walked these very streets. There was a symbol etched into one of the pages, a sigil unlike anything he had ever seen, its lines twisting in ways that defied logic. It was not a mark of any known civilization, nor was it the work of any known civilization, nor was it the work of any human hand. It was something older, something that had been carved into the earth long before the first human had ever set foot upon this land. Entities doing, or if it was their own mind unraveling, but the feeling of being watched never left them. They began to see things that were not there, figures standing in the trees, shapes moving in the periphery of their vision. They heard voices in the wind, speaking in the same language that had plagued their dreams, though they could not understand the words. The protagonist's rational mind, once so sure of itself, began to crumble under the weight of the entity's influence. They had come to Varnhold seeking knowledge, but now they found themselves consumed by the very thing they had sought to understand. The entity was not just a relic of the past. It was something alive, something that had been waiting for them. It had not been discovered by the protagonist. It had been chosen. On there, at sea. Hidden chamber beneath the Black Spire. The air grew colder as he descended, the silence thick with an unnatural stillness. The walls of the chamber were lined with carvings, each one depicting the same entity, the same shifting mass of shadows and void. Mercer's breath came in shallow gasps as he traced the symbols with his fingertips, feeling the weight of something ancient pressing against his skin. He was not alone. He could feel it, the presence that had been watching him since the moment he had arrived. And now, as he stood before the entrance to the unknown, he realized that the entity had not been forgotten. It had been waiting for him, the awakening of the forgotten. It had been waiting of the forgotten. If periphery of his vision, Mercer turned sharply, his breath catching in his throat. Days turned into weeks. The protagonist's descent into madness accelerated. They began to speak to the entity, though they did not know why. They would sit in the chamber, staring at the pedestal where the artifact had once rested, whispering questions that they did not understand. The entity did not answer, but the whispers grew louder, filling the chamber with a resonance that seemed to stretch into the void beyond the stars. The protagonist's body began to change, though they could not see it. Their movements became more erratic, their thoughts more fragmented. Their movements became more erratic, their thoughts more fragmented. They no longer knew if they were in the village or in the chamber, if they were awake or dreaming. The entity's presence was everywhere, in the air, in the ground, in the very fabric of reality itself. It was not just watching them, it was consuming. They would not see it. Their movements became more erratic, their thoughts more fragmented. They no longer knew if they were in the village or in the chamber. The chamber was empty. No shadows, no figures, no signs of light. Yet the feeling remained, a presence pressing against his mind like a whisper in the dark. He took a step forward, his boots crunching against the dust-laden floor, and the air grew colder still. The carvings on the walls seemed to shift, their lines twisting and elongating as if they were alive, watching him. He reached out, his fingers brushing against the stone, and a shudder ran through him. Then, a sound, low, resonant, like the echo of a voice that had not spoken in millennia. It did not come from anywhere in particular, yet it filled the chamber, vibrating through his bones. Mercer staggered back, his heart hammering in his chest. The walls trembled, the carvings pulsing with a faint, otherworldly glow. He could feel it now. Them, piece by piece, until nothing of the protagonist remained but the thing that had once been human. And still, the whispers continued, growing louder with each passing moment. The entity was not done with them. It had only just begun. The ancient entity's origins, the whispers that filled the chamber, were not random. They were the remnants of an ancient knowledge, a language that had existed before the first stars had burned in the void. As the protagonist's mind unraveled, so too did the veil that had long concealed the truth about the entity. It was not a being of this world, nor was it a creature of the physical realm. It was something older, something that had existed before the universe had taken shape, before time had been measured, before the stars had been born from the entity's presence, no longer distant, no longer a whisper in the wind. It was here, in the chamber, watching him, waiting. The air thickened, pressing against his skin like an unseen force. His breath came in shallow gasps as the temperature dropped further, the cold seeping into his very soul. The chamber was no longer a place of stone and dust. It was something else now, something ancient, something that had been waiting for this moment. He could feel it in his bones, in the marrow of his mind. The entity was waking, a sudden shift in the air. The shadows at the edges of the chamber deepened, coalescing into something that was not quite form, not quite void. Mercer's eyes widened as he saw it. Something vast, something that should not exist. It was not a creature, not darkness. The entity was not a god in the way that humanity had once worshipped deities, nor was there a monster in the way that myths had feared. It was a force, an entity that had no name and no form beyond the shifting shadows that had followed the protagonist since the moment they had first set foot in Varney. It was the embodiment of the unknown, the void that lay between the stars, the whisper that had always been there, waiting for someone to listen. The murals that lined the chamber, now no longer just fading images, but something more, began to reveal their secrets. They depicted the entity not as a singular being, but as a presence that had existed in the cosmos since the beginning, a force that has shaped the very fabric of a being in the way that humans understood life. It was a mass of shifting darkness, a presence that had no face, no eyes, no mouth. It was a thing of pure entropy, a force that had existed beyond time and space, and now it was here, in this chamber, in this moment. Mercer's legs buckled, his body trembling as the entity's presence grew stronger. He could feel it pressing against his mind, not in a way that was violent, but in a way that was overwhelming, suffocating. It was not trying to kill him. It was trying to kill him. It was trying to consume him, to pull him into his endless void, to make him a part of something that had no beginning and no end. He tried to move, to run, but his body would not obey. His mind was being. Universe. The figures that loomed over the smaller, human-like beings were not just representations of fear, they were symbols of the entity's dominion over the stars, over the planets, over the very essence of existence itself. The protagonist, though their mind was unraveling, could not help but feel the weight of the knowledge pressing against them. The entity was not merely ancient, it was eternal. It had no beginning and no end, no birth and no death. It had existed before the first civilizations had ever carved their names into stone, before the first humans had looked up at the sky and wondered about the stars. It had been there, watching, waiting, as the universe had expanded and the cosmos had taken shape. The whispers that filled the chamber were not just the entity's voice. They were the echoes. Pulled into the darkness, his thoughts unraveling, his sense of self slipping away. The entity was not just watching him now, it was speaking to him in a language that was not words, but something deeper, something that reached into the very core of his being. It was showing him things, images that had no place in reality, things that should not exist. He saw the birth of the universe, the collapse of stars, the endless void between the cosmos. He saw himself not as a man, but as a shadow, a whisper in the wind, a thing that had no purpose beyond the entity's will. Mercer screamed, but no sound came from his lips. The entity was not just revealing the truth. He was forcing it upon him. He could not exist. He was not just watching him, no, it was not just watching him. Tie! Ho! It was not a tie. He was not dustmost tile. It was not one that was not morage, but as a shadow, a whisper in the wind, a thing that had no purpose beyond the entity's will. Of the past, the remnants of the knowledge that had been lost to time. The entity had not been discovered by the protagonist. It had been summoned, though the protagonist did not understand how. It had been waiting for someone to come, someone who would be willing to listen, to see, to understand, and now the protagonist was that someone. As the whispers grew louder, the entity's presence became more tangible. The air in the chamber thickened, pressing against the protagonist's skin like an unseen force. The shadows that had once been mere darkness now moved, shifting and twisting in ways that defied logic. The entity was not just watching the protagonist anymore. It was speaking to them, not in words, but in thoughts, in images that flooded their mind with visions of the cosmos, of the stars that burned in. Man, he was not a man. The chamber trembled, the walls cracking, the carvings glowing brighter. The entity was not just awakening, it was returning. The entity's influence. Mercer's mind was unraveling, but he was not entirely lost. The entity's presence was overwhelming, suffocating, but it was not yet complete. It had not consumed him entirely, had not yet erased him from the fabric of reality. He was still here, still aware, still resisting. But he knew that the entity was not done with him. It had only begun. The entity's influence was not merely physical, it was psychological. It was psychological, a slow and insidious corruption that seeped into his thoughts, his dreams, his very sense of self. He could feel it in the way his mind wandered, slipping into places that should not exist. There it was not just aware, still aware. The void of the planets that had once been whole before the entity had taken its place among them. The protagonist could see the entity now, not as a single being, but as something vast, something that stretched beyond the limits of human comprehension. It was not bound by the laws of physics, nor by the constraints of time. It was a force that had existed before the universe had been created, a presence that had shaped the stars and the planets, the galaxies and the voids that lay between them. It was the force that had given birth to the cosmos, and it had remained, watching, waiting, for the moment when someone would finally understand. And now, that moment had come. The entity was not a monster, nor was it a god. It was something else, into memories that were not his own. He saw visions of things that had never happened, of places that had never been. He saw himself standing on the edge of the Black Spire, but not as a man, but as something else, something vast, something ancient. He saw the entity not as a thing of darkness, but as a presence that had always been, that had shaped the world in ways that could not be explained. His dreams became worse. At first they were only fleeting images, shadows moving in the periphery of his vision, whispers in the dark. But soon they became something more. He would wake in the middle of the night, his body drenched in cold sweat, his heart pounding in his chest. The entity was there, even in his sleep, watching him, waiting for him to break. Entirely, something that had no name, no form, no purpose beyond its own existence. It was the embodiment of the unknown, the force that had shaped the universe and would continue to do so long after the stars had burned out and the cosmos had faded into darkness. The protagonist, though their mind was unraveling, could not help but feel the weight of the knowledge pressing against them. They were no longer just an observer of the entity's presence. They were a part of it, a vessel through which the entity's will was being fulfilled. And as the whispers grew louder, as the shadows deepened and the air thickened, the protagonists knew that they were no longer themselves. They were something else now, something that had been waiting for this moment, for this revelation, and the entity, watching from the... He would see it in his reflection, in the mirror, but not as a face, not as a form. It was only a presence, a shifting mass of shadows that pressed against the glass, watching him with eyes that had no pupils, no light, only endless void. He tried to resist, to push it away, but the entity was not something that could be fought. It was not a force that could be defeated with strength or will. It was a thing that had existed beyond time, that had shaped the very fabric of reality. It did not need to conquer him. It only needed to remind him of what he was, of what he had always been. And in doing so, it was breaking him piece by piece. He began to see the entity in the places he, darkness, knew that the time had come. The final confrontation. The chamber trembled as the entity's presence surged, its form shifting in ways that defied the very laws of existence. The air was no longer just thick. It was alive, pulsing with an energy that pressed against the protagonist's skin, forcing them to their knees. The whispers had grown into a deafening cacophony, a chorus of voices that spoke in a language that was not human, yet the protagonist understood every word. The entity was no longer just watching. It was speaking, demanding, urging them to see, to know. The protagonist's mind, already frayed from the entity's influence, now shattered entirely. They could feel the weight of the entity's presence pressing into them, not just in the physical world, but in the very fabric of their being. They had never seen it before, in the flicker of a candle flame, in the movement of the wind, in the way the shadows stretched across the walls of the chamber. It was everywhere, always watching, always waiting. He could feel its presence in the air, in the silence, in the spaces between his thoughts. It was not trying to scare him, nor was it trying to kill him. It was simply waiting, waiting for him to understand. And then the visions came. He saw the entity not as a thing of darkness, but as a force that had shaped the world in ways that could not be explained. He saw the rise and fall of civilizations, the birth and death of stars, the endless void that stretched beyond the reach of human understanding. He saw himself standing at, no longer just a human, no longer just an observer of the unknown. They were something else now, something that had been waiting for this moment, for the moment when the entity's will would be fulfilled. The entity's form, once a shifting mass of darkness and light, now coalesced into something more defined, though still beyond comprehension. It was no longer just a presence, it was a force, a being that had no need for form. It had taken one for the purpose of this confrontation. Its eyes, though they had no shape, burned with an intensity that made the protagonist's vision blur, their mind reel. They could see the entity's will, its purpose, its existence stretching beyond time and space, beyond the stars and the void. It was not just ancient, it was eternal, a force that had shaped the universe. The edge of the Black Spire, not as a man, but as something else, something vast, something ancient. He saw the entity not as a thing to be feared, but as a force that had always been, that would always be. He tried to wake up, to break free from the visions, but the entity was not allowing him to escape. It was showing him the truth, the entity's revelation from him for so long. He was not a man. 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 The entity was not just revealing the truth to him. It was preparing him for something, something that had been waiting for something that had been waiting for him, for all of them. The entity was not just watching. It was not allowing him to escape. Something else, the truth, the reality that had been wait, and would continue to do so long after the stars had burned out and the cosmos had faded into darkness. And yet, the entity was not content to merely exist. It had summoned the protagonist, had chosen them, and now it demanded something in return. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they were no longer just words but thoughts, invading the protagonist's mind, filling it with visions of the entity's dominion over the cosmos. The protagonist saw the stars being born, the planets forming, the galaxies expanding, all under the entity's watchful gaze. They saw the entity's influence spreading through the universe, shaping the very fabric of reality, bending the laws of physics to its will. And then they saw the entity's entity's power was absolute, but it was not without purpose. It was not without farming, the planets forming, the galaxies expanding, all under the entity's watchful gaze. They saw the entity's influence creeping. Mercer's mind was a tempest of unraveling thoughts, his consciousness teetering on the edge of something vast and incomprehensible. The entity had not merely shown him the truth, it had forced it upon him, pressed it into the marrow of his being until he could no longer deny it. He was not a man. He was not a man. He was not a man. The words echoed in his mind, reverberating through the chambers of his soul, each repetition a hammer striking at the fragile walls of his identity. The entity was not just watching, it was preparing him for what? For what? The answer came not in words, but in images, in sensations that bypassed language and logic. He saw the world as it had been before time, before the first star had burned, before a force of destruction, nor a force of creation. It was something else entirely, a force that existed beyond the need for such distinctions. It was the embodiment of the unknown, the force that had given birth to the universe and would continue to do so long after the last star had burned out and the last planet had crumbled into dust. The protagonists, now fully consumed by the entity's presence, felt their own existence unraveling. They were no longer just a human, no longer just a human, no longer just an observer. They were something else now, something that had been waiting for this moment, for this revelation. The entity had chosen them, and now it would take them. The chamber trembled as the entity's form shifted once more, its presence expanding, filling the space around the protagonist until there was no room. They were no longer just a human, no longer just a human, no longer just a human. First breath had been drawn. He saw the entity not as a thing, but as a force, a presence that had shaped the universe in ways that could not be measured, that had existed before the first thought had ever been formed. It had not created the stars. It had merely watched them burn. It had not given rise to life. It had merely observed it, as one might observe the flickering of a candle in the wind. And now it was watching him as it had watched the first man, the first woman, the first civilization that had ever dared to name the unknown. It had not come to destroy him. It had come to remind him of what he had always been. The chamber trembled, the walls of stone groaning as if but had merely observed the flickering of a candle in the wind. And now it was watching him. Watching him. Watching him. Watch him. Left. The air was thick with the weight of the entity's will pressing against the protagonist's mind, forcing them to the edge of comprehension. They could feel the entity's presence in their bones, in their blood, in the very fabric of their being. And then the final moment came. The entity reached out, not with hands, but with something else, something that defied the very concept of touch. It was a force, a presence that surged through the protagonist's body, filling them with a knowledge that was not their own. They saw the universe as it had been, as it was, and as it would be. They saw the entity's will, its purpose, its existence stretching beyond time and space, beyond the stars and the void. And then they saw themselves. The protagonist was no longer just. Earth was straining beneath the weight of the entity's presence. Mercer's body was no longer his own. He could feel it, the way the entity's influence seeped into his muscles, into his bones, into the very core of his being. He was no longer a man standing in a forgotten chamber. He was something else now, something vast, something ancient. He was not a man. He was not a man. The entity's form shifted, its presence expanding, filling the chamber until there was no space left, no air, no light. It was not a being of darkness, nor a being of light. It was not a being of light. It was something beyond both, a force that had no need for form, no need for purpose. It simply existed, and in doing so, it had shaped the world. He was not a man. He was not a man. The entity's form shifted, its presence expanding, filling the chamber until there was no space left, no air, no light. It was not a being of darkness, nor a being of light. A human. They were something else now, something that had been waiting for this moment, for this revelation. They had been chosen by the entity, and now they would become one with it. The entity's presence surged through them, filling their mind with the knowledge of the cosmos, the secrets of the universe, the truths that had been hidden for eons. They saw the entity's will, its purpose, its existence stretching beyond time and space, beyond the stars and the void. And then the final moment came. The protagonist's body convulsed as the entity's presence consumed them, their mind unraveling, their thoughts dissolving into the void. The chamber trembled, the air thickening, the shadows deepening. The entity had taken them, and now it would continue its work, shaping the universe, bending the laws of physics to its... Unraveling, his thoughts slipping away like sand through his fingers. He could feel the entity's presence pressing against him, not as a force of destruction, but as a force of transformation. He was not being consumed. He was being changed. He was becoming something else, something that had always been, something that would always been. He tried to scream, to resist, to fight, but the entity was not something that could be fought. It was not something that could be defeated. It was not a thing of flesh and blood, nor a thing of mind and will. It was a force that had existed before time, that would exist after the last star had burned out. It was not a god nor a demon. It was not a god nor a demon. It was something else entirely. And then the final revelation came. The entity was not something that could be. Will, until the last star had burned out and the last planet had crumbled into dust, and in the darkness the entity waited, watching, waiting for the next moment, for the next seeker, for the next revelation, the aftermath of the entity's awakening. The village of Varnell was left in a silence that no wind could break, a stillness that pressed against the very fabric of existence. The protagonist was gone, their presence erased as if they had never been. The villagers, who had once watched the stranger with wary eyes, now spoke in hushed tones, their voices trembling with a fear they could not explain. They had seen what had happened, though none could say with certainty what they had witnessed. The forest, the chamber, the entity, it was all still there, but something had changed. The air was not returning to the world. It was returning to him. It had never left. It had never truly gone. It had been waiting for the moment when the time would come, when the cycle would begin again. And now it had found him. Mercer's body was no longer his own. His mind was no longer his own. He was not a man. He was not a man. He was not a man. The entity had returned. The aftermath of the forgotten. The village of Varnell was no more. The Black Spire, once a towering monolith that had loomed over the land, now stood in eerie silence, its jagged form silhouetted against the pale light of a sky that had never known the warmth of the sun. The air was thick with the scent of decay. Had thickened, the shadows had deepened, and the whispers that had once filled the village now came from the trees, from the ground, from the very stars above. The entity was no longer confined to the chamber. Its presence had spread, seeping into the village, into the land, into the very fabric of the world. The villagers spoke of strange occurrences, of lights that flickered in the trees, of shadows that moved without cause, of voices that moved without cause, of voices that whispered in the dead of night. They had tried to leave, to flee the village and seek refuge elsewhere, but the roads had become impossible to traverse. The trees had grown taller, the paths more winding, as if the land itself had conspired to keep them from escaping. The entity had not taken the protagonist, but it had claimed them, and now, of something ancient and unclean that had seeped into the very bones of the earth. The people who had once lived here were gone, their names lost to time, their presence erased as if they had never been. Only the whispers remained, carried by the wind that howled through the valley, echoing the voices of those who had seen what should not have been seen. Dr. Elias Mercer had not returned. His name was no longer spoken in the journals of those who had come before, nor in the accounts of those who had come before, nor in the accounts of those who had survived. He had not been consumed by the entity, nor had he been destroyed. He had simply vanished, leaving behind only the remnants of his presence, his journals, his notes, the ink-stained pages that spoke of things that should not have been known. Their names lost to time, their journals of those who had come before, nor in the accounts of those who had survived. He had not been consumed by the entity, nor had he been destroyed. Was waiting. The forest, once a place of mystery and fear, had become something else entirely. It no longer held the same secrets, nor did it conceal the same dangers. The trees had grown taller, their branches twisting in unnatural ways, forming shapes that could not be explained. The ground was no longer solid, but something else, something that pulsed with an unseen force. The air was thick with the scent of something ancient, something that had not been touched by time. The villagers who had once avoided the forest now found themselves drawn to it, their minds filled with visions that they could not understand. And then there were the others. The entity had not chosen only the protagonist. It had been waiting for someone, and now it was watching for the next seeker, the next one who had been lost, scattered by the wind or buried beneath the earth, their words swallowed by the void that had consumed him. Yet the entity had not gone. It had not disappeared with the last breath of the village. It had not faded into the ether, nor had it returned to the endless void from which it had come. It remained, watching, waiting, as it always had. It had not needed Mercer to be its vessel. It had merely needed him to understand. And now, with him gone, the entity had returned to the world, to the places where it had once walked, to the places where it had once been forgotten. The people who had survived the entity's return were not the same as those who had come before. They had seen things that should not have. Would come to the village, to the forest, to the chamber. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, as if the entity was calling them, urging them to come, to see, to understand. The villagers, though they had tried to leave, could not escape the pull of the entity's presence. It was in their dreams, in their thoughts, in the very air they breathed. The entity had not been defeated. It had not been banished. It had only been awakened, and now it was waiting. Waiting for the next one, for the next seeker, for the next seeker, for the next seeker, for the next moment when the universe would once again be shaped by its will. The endless watch of the entity. The entity had not been defeated, nor had it ever been meant to be. It had been defeated. It had not been defeated. It had not been defeated. It had retouring might, been seen, had felt the weight of something ancient pressing against their minds. They had not spoken of it, not in words, but in silence, in the way their eyes had turned away from the sky, in the way their hands trembled when the wind carried the whispers of the past. They had not been consumed, but they had been changed. They had become something else, something that could not be explained, something that could not be understood. The Black Spire had not crumbled. It had not been destroyed. It had merely grown, its form shifting, its presence expanding, as if it had been waiting for the moment when the entity would return. The entity was not a thing of flesh and blood. It was not a being that could be destroyed. It was something that could not be explained, something that could not be understood. The Black Spire had not crumbled. It had not been destroyed. It had not crumbled. It had not been destroyed, it had merely grown, its form shifting, its presence expanding. In the void, long before the first civilizations had carved their names into stone, it had shaped the universe, bent the laws of physics to its will, and now it waited again. The protagonist had been chosen not as a victim, but as a vessel, a conduit through which the entity's will could be fulfilled. And now the entity remained, watching from the darkness, waiting for the next seeker, the next one who would come to the village, to the forest, to the chamber. The villagers, though they had tried to leave, could not escape the pull of the entity's presence. It was in their dreams, in their thoughts, in the very air they breathed. They had seen what had happened to the protagonist, had felt the weight of the entity's presence pressing against them, and now they understood. That would always be. And now, with the village gone and the people who had once lived there lost to time, it had returned to the world, to the places where it had once walked, to the places where it had once been forgotten, and the entity would not be forgotten again. It would not be lost to time. It would remain watching, waiting, as it always had. It had not come to destroy the world. It had come to remind it of what it had always been. And now, with the last breath of the village gone, the entity had returned to the world, to the places where it had once walked, to the places where it had once been forgotten. And it would not be forgotten again. The eternal watcher, the world did not change. The entity was not just a force of destruction, nor was it a force of creation. It was something else entirely, a presence that had existed beyond time, beyond the stars, beyond the very fabric of reality. It had no name, no form, no purpose beyond its own existence. It was the embodiment of the unknown, the force that had shaped the universe and would continue to do so long after the last star had burned out and the last planet had crumbled into dust. The forest had changed, the village had changed, the village had changed, and the entity had changed. It was no longer confined to the chamber, no longer just a whisper in the darkness. It had taken the protagonist, had claimed them, and now it was waiting. Waiting for the next one, for the next seeker, for the long after the last star had burned out and the last planet had crumbled into dust. The forest had changed, the village had changed, the village had changed, and the entity had changed. It was no longer confined to the chamber, no longer just a whisper in the darkness. Not in the way that men had hoped. Not in the way that history had dictated. The village of Varnell had been erased from the map, its name lost to time, its people swallowed by the void that had once been the entity's domain. The Black Spire remained, standing in silent defiance against the sky, its jagged form a monument to something that had never truly been understood. The people who had survived the entity's return were not the same as those who had come before. They had seen things that should not have been seen, had felt the weight of something ancient pressing against their minds. And they had not spoken of it. They had not told their stories, had not passed down the knowledge that had been forced upon them. They had simply kept the silence, as if the people who had survived the entity's return were not the same as those who had come before. They had seen things that should not have been seen, had felt the weight of something ancient pressing against their mind, and they had simply kept the silence. When the universe would once again be shaped by its will, the whispers had grown louder, more insistent, as if the entity was calling them, urging them to come, to see, to understand. The villagers, though they had tried to leave, could not escape the pull of the entity's presence. It was in their dreams, in their thoughts, in the very air they breathed. And so, the cycle continued. The entity had not been defeated, nor had it ever been meant to be. It had existed before the first stars had burned, before the first stars had burned, before the first humans had looked up at the sky and wondered about the stars. It had been waiting, watching for the moment when someone would finally understand. And now, it was waiting again, waiting for the next seeker, for the next entity was calling them, one in the fine 400. The very act of remembering would summon the entity once more, but the entity was not gone. It had never been. It had merely waited, as it always had, for the moment when the time would come again. It had not needed Mercer to be its vessel. It had merely needed him to understand. And now, with him gone, the entity had returned to the world, to the places where it had once walked, to the places where it had once been forgotten. It was not a thing of flesh and blood, not a being that could be destroyed. It was something that had always been, that would always been, that would always been, that would always been. And now, with the last breath of the village gone, the entity had returned to the world, to the places where it had once walked, to the places where it had once walked, to the places where it had once walked, quote, the village, to the forest, to the chamber. The entity was eternal, and its presence would never fade. It had once been forgotten. The stars burned in the sky, their light unchanged, their patterns unbroken. The wind howled through the valley, carrying with it the whispers of the past, the voices of those who had seen what should not have been seen. The entity watched, waiting, as it always had. It did not need to speak, did not need to act. It simply existed, and in doing so it shaped the world in ways that could not be explained. It had not come to destroy the world, it had come to remind it of what it had always been. And now, with the last breath of the village gone, the entity had returned to the world, to the places where it had once walked, to the places where it had once walked, not need to act. It did not need to speak, did not need to act. One of courses, in doing so, it shaped the world in ways that could not be explained. It had not come to destroy the world. It had come to remind it of what it had always been. Do not forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more stories. Hit the notification bell to be notified of new stories when they become available. Feel free to leave a comment and tell me if you enjoyed the story and want to hear more like it. Not be forgotten again. Do not forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more stories. Hit the notification bell to be notified of new stories when they become available. Feel free to leave a comment and tell me if you enjoyed the story and want to hear more like it.